So we're going to talk a little bit right now about another creature. This is an amber snail, and amber snails got on the radar for us with something less than subtle called a $10,000 crop destruction at the Canadian border. And that got everybody's attention big time. You know, we'd had these things pop up occasionally that somebody had concern with, but that was apparently, you know, somebody just really held the stance on it. And these are interesting creatures. They are moving around a lot. So I'll talk a little bit more about them. They're a little different than some of the other critters we've been talking about in that these are actually semi-aquatic snails. So they do have a lung versus gills. They do need to breathe oxygen, but most of the species really, as I call it, they live on the edge. They live on the edge of water. So ponds, rivers, that sort of thing. And so they are just basically pond snails. There are a lot of species, and they're in you know, a number of different countries in the world, a number of states here. Not every state knows they have them in nursery systems, but I'd be surprised, you know, unless, you know, one of those middle interior states, but almost any nursery production state of any consequence has these somewhere. I have pictures that people send me from all over the country, so I know they're there. They have been ranked in the top 10 of species of potential major pest significance by Cowie, who's in Hawaii, a great malacologist who works with exotics. Some people dispute whether they're as problematic as their kind of regulatory effect is. And that has a lot to do with, again, being pond snails. They're not really adapted to eating live material all year long and a variety of live material. They generally prefer dead and decaying material. If you picture a pond and you've got cattails and other sort of semi-aquatic type of plants around the edge, and they're always kind of dying and cycling through, that's a lot of what these things eat. They are decomposers. That's what they break down. They make a good living doing that. Sometimes during the summer, with some of the native species that we're working with, they will eat some live material. The only time I've actually seen them actually eating was on the flower petals of a hibiscus. And if you think about flower petals, they're very thin, and it's almost like a decaying material. It's getting really thin and very easy to eat. Now, I have had reports of them on some other plants, and I think if push comes to shove and they have nothing to eat, again, snails tend to be omnivores, and they will eat something rather than nothing. I mean, you know, you saw that picture of the magazine. I'm sure it wasn't that tasty, but it was something. They were trying to extract some nutrition. So that's kind of something to know about these things. When we had that crop destruct, we felt like we needed more information. We didn't know the species we had or anything. So we got the nursery industry behind doing a survey, which takes a little bit of guts because you never know what you're going to find. As an extension agent, I know I don't want to find it, so they had to buy into it. And so there was a survey up in Oregon to look at these things, and they collected 267 amber snails from 25 nursery locations and sent them to Dr. Brendan Holland, who's at the University of Hawaii for DNA analysis, and he's got a huge library of DNA from this particular family of snails, the Succinidae. I can't say it right. Succinaids. The succinaids. So it came back that there were 123 unique haplotypes, and that's basically saying there's just a lot of genetic variation with these. But what they found was that 99.9% of what they found here was Oxyloma, the species, or Oxyloma retusa, if they could get it down to the species level. And oxylomas are native pond snails. Now, I say native in a very generic term, in that it could be native to Maryland, it could be native to you know, another state. but we felt pretty comfortable that it wasn't completely exotic, and it does belong in a lot of natural environments. But my pond snail might not be your pond snail in your state, and that could still bring up concern. We're up in Canada and some of these other borders. They did come up with Succinia tenella and Succinia archeri. They're actually still kind of chasing these, and these would be a little bit more of concern. When I've talked with the regulators, they already think in some ways the battle is lost with this one, but they are still trying to keep it clean. Again, what you see is that, you know, nurseries are kind of interesting. We got to keep plants irrigated, and a lot of times we have floors that aren't concrete, they're gravel. For a lot of reasons, we need that for drainage and that sort of thing. And so when you look at the gravel, there's actually really good habitat for these things. And I mentioned that size becomes an issue for regulators because these things are really kind of hard to see. They just blend in like crazy. Here's a closer shot. You can see how there's actually a number of those in there. And that's really what gets everybody's attention, is just the volume of snails out there. It's just in the millions, potentially, in some of the nursery sites. And again, this is what you see. I have to use this pointer quite a bit with these guys. They're all along here. And just look at, why does this not seem like a pond edge to these guys? So, you know, if you really want to battle an insect or any other pest, another animal, you almost have to think like that animal. You know, think like a snail for a minute. If you were a pond snail and you were living, you know, in a situation like this, it's ideal. It's got decaying plant material up there. It's ideal. And if I was going to lay an egg, I have substrate there. Now, these are different than the terrestrial snails, like the brown garden snail, in that they don't dig holes, generally speaking. They lay their eggs in plant material on the ground. Here's another example. Sometimes there's a gel matrix around here a little bit, but it's very hard to see. And so one of the first things I did when working with our growers to try to reduce the pressure from these things is basically tell them not to feed the animals. What do I mean by that? When you prune out there, the reason why there were so many snails in this one particular environment is that they had a pruning crew come in, make the plants look all nice, but they left everything on the ground, all the prunings. It was perfect. It sat there and it decayed and made great habitat. So you heard Jim talk earlier about sanitation. I think it's huge. It's huge. Now, the other problem with these things is they're so dang small. This is a juvenile. This is I think it was maybe a 5-gallon pot, or maybe a 20, but you can see it's there you go. A little bit of scale there for you. Here's my finger, and there's the snail. As an inspector, this is a nightmare. They're really tiny. They're tiny for anybody looking for this stuff. Now, the other thing is they climb. We talked about that estivation, and snails climb. And I learned this kind of in a funny way, in that we were trying to do a trial, a foliar trial, to manage these. And I went out to the nursery to collect, and I believe it was late August, and I couldn't find any snails, and I was devastated, just devastated, because I need 1,000 snails. And we were really upset because we wanted to do this trial, and all of a sudden, I saw on the side of one of those containers a little shadow, and I started looking up, and I started seeing snails in the trees. And there were a lot of snails in the trees. What we realized is that this particular snail starts to climb up in the late summer, fall into the tree canopy. So you're not finding them on the ground anymore, which is really different than some of the terrestrial snails that will be up in the summer in the hottest months, but come down when things are more amenable. So this, for some reason, finds that it needs to go up in that time of year, maybe because the rains are coming, and they need to get away so that they won't drown. If you, in the literature, when they talk about these pond snails, they live on the edge and they move as the water if they're fast little guys, they move as the water moves. If it rains, the water gets bigger, then they kind of move out. If they're not fast or things are happening really quickly, they climb up. It's another strategy to get away from the flooding. So this would make sense that as we get back into the rainy season, they're going to go up and try to hang out there. Why is this important? Well, for one thing, if you're baiting on the ground or whatever, they're not there. That's not where they're at, so they're not going to be in contact with your baits. The other thing is they're really, really visible, and you can actually, with foliar sprays on the plants, hit these things at that time of the year. They're actually more accessible. So that's very useful for us when we're trying to time some of our applications. So this is the general shape of an amber snail. It's got a slightly different shell than what you see. And I couldn't say whether you have the species that we have. I think it's likely, but you may have more down here. It's very, very hard to tell them apart, and that's why regulators really brook no presence of them, because they can't tell the native pond snail apart from something that might be really, really horrendous in that family from another country. You just can't tell them apart. They're what we call polymorphic. There's a lot of different colorings in the same species, in the same population. In fact, one article I read, one paper I read on them, is along the side of the pond, in the wetter, muddier areas, they tend to be darker in color. And as you go out to the edge of the pond where there's more just plants and lighter colored ground, the color morph tends to be a little lighter tan color, more the amber that they're named after. So that would make sense. They'd blend into their environment better. So this is really pretty typical. You can see how small they are. Here's another example on the side of a pot. I think that's a quarter. You can tell they can be very, very tiny, but that's generally kind of what they look like out there when they're fully exposed in the muddy sort of environment. So what you need to really think about with these is prevention if possible. So you already heard that about the holding areas, and I think it's a really good idea. I know of at least one nursery, a large nursery, that has managed to escape these by vigilance, looking at everything they bring in. And they have detected them shipped from another state down in the south of the country, not here. Didn't even think they had pond snails, but they shipped them up to this nursery, and they managed to intercede in a way that stopped the population from getting started. But you need to look very, very closely at the plants because of the size. There's a tag on the side of a container, and you can see how they're hiding there under the tag. You need to look under the lip. You need to look on the bottom of the container in the drain holes when you're looking. We've even found them in bamboo, the stakes, because there's usually that hollow part of a bamboo stake. And if that's at the very top, then we've found them actually hiding inside of there. So again, look up, especially as you go into late summer and September type of months, that a lot of times the population is going to be up in the canopy. So if you're shipping that time of year, you've got to train inspectors or workers or whatever to look where they're actually going to be. And again, that plant debris on the ground, make sure that's gone because that's where that population of eggs is going to be. And they lay pretty good clutches there. And this is one of those species that I mentioned, they sort of lay all their eggs in one season. They have they start laying eggs in the spring, and that population can hatch and become fully reproductive by the fall. And they can lay another clutch then that will overwinter. So those are things to consider if you really have one season where you have to kind of look twice in the early spring and then late summer to intervene. So we did a trial to see if we could manage them. I used protocol from Rob Hollingsworth, who works a lot with in Hawaii with a great team of malacologists. They have some of the best in the world there. And Rob was doing some trial work with those. And so we put a known number of snails in on simulated plants, did repetitions of the trials in 2010, and applied with a backpack sprayer. And what our objective was to evaluate some of the practices that our growers were already using to manage, and then look at some of the more novel types of materials around. So methiocarb, the measure-all, metaldehyde, in this case we looked at Slugfest, the liquid formulation. And then we had some growers who, because they have a wide pest array as well, have used 7 quite often in the nurseries for things, and they wanted to know if they were picking up amber snails with those. We also looked at the limonene, the orange guard. I mentioned it smells just like orange, the distilled citrus. We looked at another product called dazitol, which is a combination product, again botanical. It's capsaicin, which is hot pepper, and the other is allyl isothiocyanate, which is, you may have heard of mustard plants, and sometimes they've dug those into the ground and gotten the vapam-like effects from the botanicals. And this is the same sort of activity. And then the cinnamon oil in the snail and slug away, and then we had an untreated control. And so we were really excited with these results because, for one thing, the traditional materials were giving us pretty good kill, 90 and 88%, which is still not 100%, but for those tiny little snails, that seemed pretty good trying to hit all of those. And then we got some very, very nice control with the orange guard at 78 and 71% with the dazitol. And those statistically were similar to what we got from the carbamate, so pretty exciting there. Nothing really different from the untreated control, in this case with the Slugfest and the snail and slug away, the cinnamon. In this case, we figured out we were using too low a rate. It was a 1% rate, and we needed a 2% rate. So we knew we needed to do more work on it, and we did another trial. In this case, I changed the protocol a little. We had naturally infested plants, and then we put some additional snails on to make sure that we had snails in there. And this is kind of interesting. And this is closer to what you're actually looking at in a facility. You've got a lot of debris, a lot of stuff that they can be under. And we have these, in this case, salt moats, so that we keep them all confined. And in this case, we saw quite different results in that, again, the carbamates did very well. We saw some very good activity, but in this case, those botanicals that we were working with, the dazitol and the orange guard, did not perform statistically significant from the untreated control. So what that tells me is that they work very well probably with good contact. If you actually hit the snails, you can kill them. But if you don't, if they're protected in any way, you don't really have a residual with these botanicals. Sometimes we don't want the residual. That's what makes these things soft. But it doesn't last. And so that is a bit of a difficulty. Now, again, if you're spraying some of these soft things when these things are climbing up in the trees in the late summer, fall, you might be able to use a soft product if somebody's got a soft type of program or organic or whatever. This might be a tool for you. But just consider that out there. We also wanted to look at baits, and so we set up a bait trial, and these are actually cake pans modified for our purposes. It's not a cakewalk out there by any means, but they work very well for our trials. And then we set up a mist system as well because, again, so when you want an animal, it's really hard sometimes to keep it alive or to get it when you're trying to do these trials. And that can teach us things. That one of the things we learned with those amber snails is they dried out and died very quickly, particularly at higher temperatures. Our first trials, our controls died like crazy because it was about 80 degrees and we just couldn't keep the humidity up high enough. So we countered that with a lot of misting and that sort of thing, but that can tell you what that irrigation, drying things out, can do. A little heat, a little dry can toast these things. And then we set up what we call choice and no choice types of treatments. So with the bait, they might also have some food in there. In this case, it was carrots, but again, if you think about a nursery floor and there might be plant debris, they'll have an alternate food to that bait in many of these situations. And also sometimes we had situations where there was no choice, and they had to eat the bait. I don't know, this almost looks like a smiley face to me. I don't know the angle of that. Happy face. And so this is kind of what it looks like when they're out there feeding. In that case, you can see they love carrots. Don't have carrot debris in your nursery, I'll tell you that. Also in other cases, you know, they had nothing, and they ended up, you know, going into the food. That gives you a feel for that. And this is our first trial in this. We're hoping that we can restage this trial to see. It's always nice to have 2 years of the same type of trial. But just on a preliminary basis, as you can see, what we saw was pretty good activity with the Metarex here. And this was with food. Again, good activity of Sluggo without food, but Sluggo with a food source in there, they didn't go to the Sluggo at all. They didn't feed that. It didn't do anything. Ferox, which is a chelated iron product, and David has more information on this, actually looked good with and without food. So here it is here, and there it is there. So we got some pretty good activity with that, and you could see that right away. You know, these things ate it, and they didn't look good. So I think, you know, some of the traditional baits as well as some of the newer baits will work somewhat on these. Nothing is 100%, unfortunately, but we're getting there. And I think you're going to have to keep at it with these things. I don't think you can clean up an infested nursery. I'll just make that stand right now. I think it's really hard. Maybe a greenhouse. But when I've looked at these gravel situations and that sort of thing, I don't really see it happening. What I told the growers I'd be willing to work with them on is disinfesting shipments and hopefully reducing pressure. What I don't want nurseries to have to do is sit there with a shipment due to go out, find these snails, and have to spray Measure All and wait 48 hours and ship. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to have to do that, but that's really what people feel compelled to do. I think we have some other choices here for that, but I think we still want to look at low reentry types of materials that get the snails off the shipments. And I don't think, again, that you have to kill them. You just have to get them off. So we could repel them as well and get them off shipments if it's something noxious enough. The last thing I want to mention with these things is, again, going out to collect for another trial, they were irrigating. You know, all the impact sprinklers were on. I was kind of bummed because I didn't want to get soaked while collecting, so I hung out on the edge for a while. And we collected on the edge. We really didn't have a problem getting them. But one of the things I noticed when those sprinklers were on, and they were on maybe a half hour or so, water builds up. Now this was on a, you know, it had a really nice grade to it for drainage. They had some gravel out there, but what happens is the water built up. And I think this happens in a lot of nurseries. And we could see the snails climbed up. Again, these are not aquatic snails. They're semi-aquatic. They will drown. And they are smart enough. They've evolved to avoid drowning by climbing when the water starts coming up. That's their natural behavior. So if you're picking for a shipment right after you water, you may end up with much more of an infestation in that shipment than if you were picking dry. Now, I know that's really hard for large nurseries to manage that. I know it's crazy. I always talk about water management, and it's like we water when we can. We've got sprinklers on in the nursery all day, all night sometimes. I understand that. But what it makes me start thinking about with these things is if, instead of having this, can we get another layer of gravel out there, maybe another inch, depending on how much standing water you have, but get those plants above the standing water. If there's a way you can get them above the standing water, I think it's a lot less likely that you're going to ship an infested plant. It's a cultural technique, but it should work. We need to test this, you know, in replicated trials, but I really would suggest if look at how much standing water you have if you have these as a problem. I don't really think the pond snails are going to be a problem in landscapes or that sort of thing, maybe on the edge of a pond again in a very, very wet area. But I don't think in general these are going to be problems in landscapes. They are just too associated with wet. Well, I think that in general most of the material on controlling them that I know how to do yet with them. We've had a lot of help with the, like I mentioned, Rob Hollingsworth and the ODA and Oregon Association of Nurseries and J. Frank Schmidt have funded our work, and we've had a lot of help from the industry on this. And this is James Copeland. James works a lot with me on this. James is a malacologist from Ontario, Canada, who does a great number of trials and been working with snails all over the world, and has an interesting sense of humor as well. We always had fun. We had a trip to Disneyland and other nurseries down there at a Society of American Florist meeting, and tried not to tell them how many snails they had in these nurseries. But you know, snails are just, it's a good habitat in nurseries and in our landscapes. And so modifying that is a big part of what we're going to need to do. And this is as lovable as I can make a snail look. It's not my photo, but it's almost cute here, but not really. So that's it on that.